What I want to do is to give you a very quick overview of the international trading system over the last 75 years, and to end with some thoughts that we have had in the work we're doing in UNCTAD on rethinking the multilateral system in what we see as a more progressive direction. A lot of people have asked during the various sessions that I've been to about Bretton Woods, and Bretton Woods is 75 years old this year. Indeed, 75 years ago, 700 people in the mountains of New Hampshire were debating the future of the international economic system, and they had two big ideas essentially. They didn't want to go back to the 1920s and the lack of coordination that followed the First World War, essentially because the United States refused to participate. So they wanted a system where you had proper policy coordination. That ended up as a fight, as I'm sure you all know, between the US and the UK. And if you missed it, the US won. But that was one. The other thing is they didn't want to go back to the 1930s either, and the idea that you adjusted to economic shocks through austerity measures of one kind or another. And the inspiration there, of course, for that part of the discussion was the American New Deal. And so, in a way, Bretton Woods was trying to internationalize the New Deal. That meant they wanted a system that was consistent with full employment, with a wage bargaining system in which labor had a strong voice, and what the Americans call social security, or in Western Europe we tended to refer to as the welfare state. And they understood that if you wanted those kind of goals, you could not leave the ordering of the international system to finance capital or to free, unregulated markets. So they didn't want a free trade was not on the agenda at Bretton Woods. They did not want a free trade system. They wanted a balanced and managed system of trade. They wanted to regulate, in particular, capital flows, which had been a destructive part of the agenda in the 1930s. They didn't want hot money running across borders, causing the kind of disruption that had been very destructive and chaotic in the 1930s. And they wanted to make sure that governments had the policy space to be able to fulfill that new agenda that had been emerging out of the chaos of the 1930s. So that was, yes, I don't really need to explain to this audience what happened in 1979. Thatcher takes power, brother in arms, more kind of Brill cream and neoliberal bromides than Mrs. Thatcher perhaps, took power in Washington. Government was not the solution to the problem, government was the problem, was Reagan's slogan at that time. And the other figure that is often forgotten in terms of having a major say in rejigging the system, of course, was Paul Volcker, the head of the Federal Reserve. Volcker was put there actually by Jimmy Carter, but Volcker engaged in a major rethinking of US domestic monetary policy. Interest rates went through the roof. This was the basis both of shredding the domestic social contract, but also of reviving the rules of the international agenda in a way that eliminated any of the last vestiges of the Bretton Woods system. So promoting free trade, which had been rejected in 44 and 45, became the basis of a new way of thinking about international policy making. Deregulation of capital markets was a central part of that platform, and the reduction of policy space available to countries to manage their economies for full employment, etc., was a major target for governments in the international arena. And essentially that was an agenda. We think of it about, essentially often we think about it, and if for those people who have followed the debates on the Washington Consensus, this was a discussion about states versus markets, and that's true to some extent, but that's a very negative way of thinking about it. The real agenda that was in play from 79 onwards, I think, was how you made the world safe for footloose capital. That was what the agenda was fundamentally about. That meant essentially both protecting the profits of international capital and opening up more and more spaces where those profits could be made. It required new legislation on intellectual property rules. It required new legislation at the international level on investment protection. It required new rules on government procurement and who could sell and buy from governments. And it required new rules on financial services as a way of opening up this space for a much more footloose kind of capital, which is what the architects of Bretton Woods were trying to remove from the system. And the Uruguay round of trade negotiations that begins in 1986 was essentially about trying to get these things into the rules of the international trading system. The agreement of the Uruguay round provided the kind of basis on which free trade agreements of one kind or another and bilateral investment treaties mushroomed in the period from the late 1980s onwards. And these are a much more virulent form of international trade agreement that in a way did many of these things. They not only strengthened intellectual property rules, provided protection to international big business, but also opened up government services and financial services to international suppliers. And you can see from this kind of chart that these kind of agreements do begin to proliferate in the late 1980s as the Uruguay round is coming to a close. The Uruguay round ended in 1994. So free trade agreements become this very powerful weapon for rejigging the rules of the international economy. And famously, Voltaire said of the Holy Roman Empire, as I'm sure you know, it was not holy, it was not Roman, and it certainly wasn't an empire. And free trade agreements are much the same. They're not about freedom, they're about tying the hands of government. They're not about trade, they're about all these other things that you need to put into trade agreements about strengthening the position of capital. And they're not agreements. There's a huge amount of lobbying and arm twisting and lack of transparency to get these things through, particularly when you're forcing them on developing countries. And so this is the world that we essentially now live in. It's what we call a hyper-globalized world. It's what Daniela yesterday in her presentation talked about in terms of the wall moving from the Washington consensus, which is kind of more plain vanilla neoliberalism, to what she called as the Wall Street consensus, which is very much about providing the rules of the game to support essentially large predatory multinational corporations. And that's what they look like, essentially. If you want to know what predatory capitalism looks like, it kind of looks like this. The top line here is the share of profits that have been the increase in the share of profits taken by the world's largest corporations. The red line, it's on an upward trend. The bottom line is the global share of labor in world income. So there's an almost direct comparison in terms of these two trends as large international corporations have captured more of global income. Organized labor has seen their share of global income decline, and that's what the rules of the game within the international trading system are essentially all about.